Welcome to today's Hedgeweek webinar, discussing the latest threats, best forms of mitigation, and most pressing regulatory compliance challenges and concerns. This is supported by Linedata. With the instability and economic challenges we've all seen globally over the past 2 years, alongside the war in Ukraine, we've seen unprecedented instability and serious pressures on businesses and the public across the world. With the financial markets stumbling and serious pressures being felt financially by consumers of the financial markets, it's no surprise that there is a heavy concentration on the health of the global economy, regulatory compliance, and cybersecurity adherence. In such unstable times, cybersecurity and regulatory adherence can fall to the bottom of the priority list, whilst investment firms look to focus on how to navigate the current changing economic environment. The question is, how do you ensure cybersecurity regulation is still considered a priority? And what does good cybersecurity practice really mean? My name is Jed Gardner. I run IT and technology for Linedata services globally. I've been involved in IT and cybersecurity for over 20 years, deploying, designing, and designing products across our business. And I will be working with the panelists today, moderating this panel, and I'm looking forward to having a very good conversation with them. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. We want this panel to be as engaging as possible. So for those of you viewing this live, please share your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the discussion, and I'll do my best to find time for the panelists to answer your questions. We're also recording this session, so feel free to watch the recording at your convenience and share it with colleagues and friends for whom it may be of interest. And with that said, I'm going to hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves quickly, and then we'll get straight into it. Don.
Good morning. My name is Don Duclos. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Linedata, and I've been working in cybersecurity and information security for roughly 20 years.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Krieger. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer and General Counsel at Jackson Square Partners. We're a long-only equity shop based out of San Francisco. I've been in the industry. I started my career at the SEC, actually with Steve, and then went to a law firm in New York, and then moved into both legal and compliance roles at different asset managers. And I'm happy to be here today.
Good morning, everyone. Pleased to be with you. My name is Steve Yadagari. I am the founder and CEO of PhiSolve, which is a company that provides outsourced chief operating officer, general counsel, legal and compliance services to firms in the financial services industry. I had worked about 16 years as a COO and GC of a $14 billion investment management firm. As Sean mentioned, we started our careers together at the SEC, and he and I also worked together at one of the New York law firms he worked at. Very pleased to be with you. I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, guys. So Sean, let's get started with you. How are you keeping your firm focused on staying compliant with cybersecurity, and what challenges have you had trying to do that?
Well, the challenge for me is that things are so dynamic and changing. And so anyone who says that they feel 100% confident in their program really, and from my opinion, doesn't know what they're talking about. I feel like cybersecurity is what keeps me up at night more so than even the SEC. I feel like it can have like dire consequences to the business, you know, both from a reputation, regulatory, and just, you know, loss of all of your assets effectively. What I'm doing to try to alleviate some of those concerns is one, relying on experts in the industry. So making sure that you have service providers and consultants that are more well-versed in the risks that we're facing, constantly testing our program So having reports that we can assess and ensure that things are working the way they should be, conducting different types of audits and assessments of your program, both internally and through external providers. And then also just staying on top of the different issues that come out that you hear about in the news, and taking different types of attacks that different firms have had, and looking at those and assessing, could those things happen at my firm? How are we prepared to deal with this? And in my case, we rely heavily on outsourced service providers, including we outsource our IT and cyber to a third party. So when those issues come up, reaching out to our relationship manager and asking for an explanation from their security team as to how they've had controls in place to mitigate that. And it's a little self-serving, but I document all that. And I do so because I want to get credit for that if, one, we're having an audit, or two, if the SEC asks a question. It's always better to be able to demonstrate, well, we thought about this issue, this is how we dealt with it, and get credit for something that could otherwise be detrimental to you if it looks like you haven't been doing anything to try to stay atop of these type of risk.
So you mentioned it's interesting because you're outsourcing your cybersecurity function. A couple of questions. How do you feel? How comfortable do you feel with that versus if you had an internal team that were doing it? And the second question is, how do you ensure that your outsourced provider is providing everything that they say they are?
Sure. So I actually feel more comfortable outsourcing cyber and IT. And what I would say is that I've worked at other asset managers where we had internal IT staff and a CISO. And unless you're at a really large asset manager, it's difficult to have adequate resources to support and sustain that program. And so, relying on our outsourced IT service provider that has 100+ asset management clients across the globe, they have significant resources that they can spend in having a very effective cyber program, the antivirus software they're using, different malware, third-party patching, things like that, that I would think would be really expensive for a standalone asset manager to actually maintain. So there's that. On the second question around how do I stay comfortable with this outsourced model, first of all, I'd say that it's easier from a diplomacy perspective to call out an external service provider, or to ask them really uncomfortable questions that it may not be as easy to do with an internal person who may get really defensive. So there's that. And then I would also say that the way I've gotten comfortable with it too is shortly after joining Jackson Square, our outsourced service provider had already been in place. We retained a third-party consultant that now tests our outsourced IT service provider, and we have an ongoing engagement with them. So, they're doing separate and apart from our outsourced service provider. They do penetration tests yearly for us. They also do external and internal network scans. So they pick out issues that they've identified that our outsourced service provider hasn't addressed. And then I have our outsourced service provider explain to me why they haven't addressed those. So I can at least demonstrate that we're not just relying on this third-party service provider, which I guess, as all of us know, based on yesterday's release from the SEC and the expectations around mission critical service providers will no longer be acceptable in any case. You're going to have to be able to demonstrate ongoing diligence and supervision of the service providers, assuming that release actually goes into effect.
Okay,
So,
interesting. Yeah, sorry, go on, Dom.
I heard a couple of things there that I just wanted to pick up on. It sounds like you get economies of scale from your service provider, depth of expertise. It sounds like you're getting solid reporting if you weren't initially, which allows you to show that you're managing the provider and the risks associated with security.
Yes, that's correct. And so we have a set of standard reports that are available to us in our service providers portal that internally, and this is based on like recommendation from an auditor, a third party auditor at one point, we on a monthly basis pull those reports from their system, and we have an internal group that looks at them and try to pick up anomalies. And we do that because we've been, as part of our SLAs with our outsourced IT service provider, those issues are supposed to be identified to us in real time if there's a material issue. And so by looking at those reports, it's another way for us to supervise and make sure that our service provider is actually living up to those SLAs and that we're not just blindly relying on them.
And this engagement also develops artifacts in case you're audited so that you can demonstrate that you're doing this.
That's right.
Excellent.
So we have a folder that we keep all of the cyber incidents, and I use incidents like in quotes because we haven't had like a material issue or a third party attack, but all of these type of things. I mean, a simple example is a few years ago when there was the whole issue around Kaspersky. Our outsourced service provider actually utilized Kaspersky, and so we had like a big discussion with them and with their CISO on whether Kaspersky was the right firm to continue working with. And, we ended up documenting all that in our file so we could at least show to, a client if they asked, or to a regulator, that we at least thought of that issue. And again, and this is probably me with my lawyer CCO hat on. I know from my time at the SEC, you only get credit for things that you can actually prove that you did. And so if you're going to spend the time looking into these type of things, spend the extra 15, 20 minutes and just draft up an internal note to file or memo, just so you can, get credit for that down the road if you're in an SEC audit. Or even also another would be if you have cyber insurance like we do, and you end up in an incident later on down the road and you're trying to, claim on that cyber insurance, insurance carriers, and maybe I'm a little cynical, but they're always going to try to get out of paying. And so, one of their arguments will be whether you had an adequate program in place to actually capture these type of issues. If you have these in your file, they're going to go a lot of way to show that you actually were thinking about these issues and trying to stay on top and act in a good practice.
That's right. Absolutely.
So Steve, moving over to you. You deal with a lot of different types of investment companies providing your services. How familiar are you seeing a trend of outsourcing versus internal IT? And do you see, from your point of view, what kind of risks do you see of both? It's an interesting subject.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about outsourcing and maybe share with you two other trends that I'm seeing that are relevant to this discussion. On the outsourcing front, I'm certainly seeing a great deal of interest in outsourcing either some or all of the function, IT and cybersecurity function, to third parties. I think in part that has to just do with the fact that the very nature of this area, as Sean alluded to, it's dynamic, it's changing. It's not easy to always find people, first of all, the real expertise that are in this day in and day out, who can attend to the issues, the changing nature of things. Even if you're fortunate enough to have someone like that in-house. And at my last firm, we had a CISO, Greg Caporal, who was outstanding, and he was very skilled and able to deal with these issues. However, we had to supplement Greg with some additional resources because even one knowledgeable person can only do so much. So we would partner with some third parties who can help to fill some of the technology gaps, some of the upkeep, the maintenance, the actual security devices that are required. These are all things that have to be considered and are constantly changing. And the cost and upkeep of doing it internally, particularly for a smaller advisor, is almost impossible. It's prohibitively expensive and it's too much of a drain. So more people are moving in this direction. Many more firms are doing it. Even larger firms, to the extent they have internal teams, they're looking to supplement those teams with the outside expertise, which could be very valuable. And with the rule proposal yesterday, it will prescribe a number of new requirements that advisors will have to undertake in this area. It seems to me that the rule proposal would cover cybersecurity and IT as one of the core functions under the proposal. And as a result, there will be certain initial due diligence requirements, ongoing diligence requirements, documentation. And then another element, which is interesting, is the advisors who are working with outsourced providers, including cyber and IT, will have to receive certain representations from those providers that they will be given the types of information that are contemplated under the rule, almost as a matter of contract. And that part's going to be interesting, because for smaller advisors, when you're dealing with these much larger groups, there isn't always equal bargaining power. And it's going to be interesting to see how that's addressed through this rule proposal.
And that new rule proposal that we all saw yesterday, which mentions core functions of the business, right? I think what you're saying is it's going to increase the amount of requirement to tick some boxes to be able to use outsourced providers, not trying to prohibit the use of outsourced providers.
That's exactly right. There will be additional requirements, some additional compliance burdens. There was a split amongst the commissioners as to the approach here, where one commissioner felt as though the fiduciary duty already covers all of this, and advisors should already be taking all of the steps that are included in the proposal, or at least calibrate their approach to sort of meet the business model that they're offering to their clients. But the majority of the commission felt as though the industry has evolved to such a point where these more prescriptive rules are required in order to protect investors. And like some of the more recent rule proposals, there isn't a whole lot of time for people to digest and comment on this proposal. I think we're given 30 days from when it's published in the Federal Register, or December 27th, whichever's later. So it's a very short turnaround time to digest this and comment. However, this will have pretty significant ramifications, and I think some of the industry groups are already taking a look and coordinating with their constituents to figure out how to best respond.
And you said that you're seeing some other trends throughout the market where you're working with your clients. What would those trends look like?
Yeah, thank you. Well, two I would mention is, one is the pace and number of attacks on firms in the financial services industries and hedge funds continues at a pretty aggressive clip. These attacks are getting more sophisticated. When they occur, if they're successful, they're taking more time and expense to resolve. One just quick indicative example, just that shows the importance of security and training that we've seen in, unfortunately, more than one occasion, are these phishing scams where there's email impersonation, and you have a fraudster. One firm that's an advisor to both hedge funds as well as private accounts, a client service representative who worked with one particular client, and their manner of communication was always via email. Well, a fraudster created a fictitious email account that looked very much like the client's real email account, just transposed 2 letters in the last name. It was very clear that the fraudster had infiltrated the client's email, learned the way in which he communicated, the language he used. It was very, sophisticated in terms of modeling it as to prior correspondence, and even created a fake chain of correspondence leading up to a request to transfer a significant amount of money into a fictitious account. And unfortunately, the client service representative took the bait and transferred initially very small amounts, 10 to 15,000. Once those were successful, the fraudster was emboldened and started requesting greater amounts. And eventually, just by sheer luck of the genuine client calling with a question and the client service representative mentioning the recent transfer, it became clear that a fraud had taken place. Couple of things that they did right here. Immediately after discovery, they contacted the FBI, which allowed them to recover some of the funds. They contacted their insurance broker. And to Sean's earlier point, fortunately, they had some mitigation steps in place and documentation that helped bring a successful claim forward. But it really just shows the vital importance of training, having verification steps put in place, and to recognize that these threats can come from multiple places, not just internally at your own firm, but there may be something that occurs with a client's security that could then in turn affect how the way in which you're interacting with them.
Yeah, and it's an important factor, right? I think everyone on this call right now is thinking, well, how did they get into their email and learn all of this and to be able to impersonate them? But it's not all, I mean, there's two factors, right? You can't protect against everything. There are new ways of getting into things all the time, and everyone is always slightly behind the curve, no matter how up to date you are. And the second thing is that bad actors inside a company who have access naturally to those resources, can carry out those types of attacks by giving information away. And I think the discussion that I hear quite a lot is, how do we stop it? How do we stop it? And it's really preventative. And like you say, it's really about training. Who are you sitting next to? Do they look right? Do they have? Are they behaving in the right way? If you think it looks weird, it probably is. And so it's better to say something than not, you know. And it's not trying to get away from a coherent workplace where everyone's getting on, but it is, you know, it's making sure that everyone's aware and that they report something as soon as they think it's happened, and making sure that they can recognize an email that's trying to phish them when they see it. So yeah, so anything else that you want to add from a trend perspective?
Yeah, the one last trend I would just mention is just with respect to addressing risks that come with this seemingly new hybrid workplace environment. You know, it began with everyone working from home. I think the industry did a phenomenal job with respect to just maintaining operations in order while working from home. However, many new devices were being used in order to access information, including critical and private information. And a lot of these devices sometimes would operate under unsecured Wi-Fi networks, which obviously increases some risk. So I've seen some increased investment in things like endpoint security, and also just discussions that firms are having with their employees about some of the things that they should keep in mind in this new environment. Okay,
great, thank you. So Don, Linedata recently co-authored the HedgeWeek Cybersecurity Survey. The Sean and Steve's insights match what the survey picked up. Were there any surprises that came out of that?
Actually, Sean and Steve's insights are right in line with the survey. The only thing in the survey that surprised me was that in Europe, they have deployed more infrastructure security monitoring. In my experience, the European regulators are more hands-off, where the US regulators are very hands-on. So usually, and across all of the other categories, you see that the US is further along in deployment of these tools. I did want to mention that, as Steve had said, so we have too seen an uptick in targeted phishing among our customers, very akin to what Steve mentioned. They're trying to insert themselves into the accounts payable process or into the funding process, which is even bolder. And they are trying to, you know, insert fake invoices or to divert money as it comes into the funding process. So it's getting very advanced. Okay, great. And you mentioned what you're seeing across Linedata clients. When you're talking to our clients about cybersecurity and you're in with the CEOs and the COOs of the world of the clients that Linedata services, what kind of concerns are you seeing? What kind of discussions are you seeing happening? What kind of information are you getting from that? So I am seeing that there is a huge concern with phishing. We are trying to push our customers in the right direction, if you will. We encourage them to do phishing training and testing. We encourage automated phishing controls through Office 365 or Tipping Point or something like that. And we also encourage, we have put together a solution called Linedata Protect and Linedata Protect Premium that we use to monitor and respond to a broad array of events from pretty much anything that can generate logs. And so we've developed a managed detection, response, and remediation solution that we're using to help our clients in this area.
So would you say when you talk about managed detection and response, for anyone who doesn't know what that is, that's where you have consistent monitoring. It picks up any sign of intrusion or attack that's happening on any of the devices in the network. It can then block off immediately without permission or with permission that device to stop the attack from happening. Have you seen two questions about that? First one, I think it's got a lot of interest, not because of necessarily the regulatory side of things. I think it's also because of the fact that it's providing COOs and CEOs with a sense of security that they can sleep at night, that their data is protected.
That's correct. It provides them with greater visibility into what's going on in their environment. And as you said, so the solution brings together a SIEM solution to monitor the logs, 24-hour, 365 SOC, Security Operations Center to respond to those logs, Network Operations Center, which is also 24/7 by 365 to remediate anything that is found. As you said, it can take logs from anything that can generate logs.
So the thing that interests me about this is well, as a technologist, one of the coolest things that I think it can do is automatically with some security automated response software, it's able to immediately block the attack, right?
That's right. We can pre-build rules. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So are you seeing? You can also within that product give the option to do a manual block, right, once it's been assessed. But which options are you seeing come across? Because it's interesting to me, because when you think about good cybersecurity practice as a technologist, I would want it to block it immediately, right? That comes from a technology place. But from a business place, I wonder if the business units or the customers that you're talking to would like a say in what's blocked and when.
So we're seeing a mix. We prefer to block automatically and then immediately engage the customer. But some of our customers would prefer that we engage first. And then in some customers, what we see is the rank and file, it's okay to block, but maybe there's 2 or 3 critical employees that they want us to engage first. Okay,
like investment managers and those type.
Exactly right.
Okay.
People that make a lot of money per minute.
Yes, absolutely. So back to Steve and Sean. You've got an SEC background, and I wrote this question way before yesterday, and obviously there's the core function release that we've just seen yesterday. Is there anything that you're seeing in that the SEC is releasing as cybersecurity guidance that you want to share with everyone here? Is there anything that you see in the future that's coming down the road that you think is going to impact investment houses as we move along?
Well, I guess I could jump in first. I think there is another rule proposal that's specific to cybersecurity that was proposed in February, which everyone is watching very closely. Among other things, it would require advisors to adopt specific policies and procedures, which include periodic risk assessments. I think Sean would tell you that many of us are already doing that and have these types of procedures already in place or should. The most difficult element of the rule proposal is a reporting requirement where advisors would be required to notify the SEC of any potential significant incidents within 48 hours of having a reasonable belief that an incident has occurred or is ongoing. And I think the reason that's caught everyone's attention is it's a very short turnaround period. It's 48 hours. And also it's not, you don't, the advisor does not need to conclude an incident that has occurred, but rather have a reasonable belief there may be something going on. And, you know, for anyone who's been in the seat, when you may be going through an incident, those like first several hours, days are just very frantic as you're trying to get an understanding as to what is happening. And, you know, a requirement that while this is just beginning to unfold and you're not even really sure what you're dealing with, you have to notify the commission. It's very difficult, very onerous, and it's also not in line with other disclosure requirements, which are either after you've made a conclusion or at least some period of time longer than 48 hours.
Yeah, and it's quite a grey area, right? I mean, you think something might be going on. It's quite a grey area, and I think that's a bit of a difficult one to be able to assess. And I think, you know, my view on this is I think it's going to be very difficult to enforce because of that. I think there's going to be a lot of legal compliance officers sitting there thinking, yeah, I think I can probably deal with that if it ever came up.
Yeah, I would echo what Steve said, and maybe the cynic in me looks at the initial rule from February, I think, with respect to cybersecurity, and now this additional requirements around like outsourced service providers, and I just see the cash register door opening up. And the big issue I see is the cost, really in particular for the smaller firms, you know, firms that in some regard are outsourcing some of these functions or their cyber program because they don't have the resources internally, in part because they're small and may not have the same revenue of a really large corporation. And the SEC, although I do think that there's some value in what they're proposing, it may be outweighed by the cost to the industry. And so I feel like in many ways, smaller firms that don't have as much in the way of resources may be, may in some ways, if these rules actually come into place, be put into a position where they're you know, going to have deficiencies no matter what they do, just because they can't sustain the costs associated with implementing a program that would meet the SEC requirements.
And in that scenario, you know, let's say that a fan does find itself in that scenario. Would you say the best approach is to do the best you can, make sure you've got as much evidence as possible, just try and do what you can to make sure that you're achieving as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's all you can do, right? And,
yeah,
you know, Jed, like make a good faith effort, be able to document what you have done based on the resources that you have available. And at the end of the day, it may not be enough to alleviate like a deficiency from the SEC or a slap on the wrist, but it might avoid, you know, bigger fines or consequences.
Okay, great. Yeah, so sure. Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to add, I've struggled with this my entire career. As a security practitioner, I find that there is a great deal of value in security. I find that it costs a lot more than I would like it to implement it well. And I do agree that I've seen even large organizations struggle with the cost of security. So I do think it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah. I mean, you know, dealing with the SEC, I think they can come across as aggressive when they're looking at or auditing you in some way, or even just, you know, a general audit. Nothing's happened, just coming to see whether you've got everything in place. Although I feel that initial period with them when you're going through that process is quite heavy. As you move along and they start to understand how your business operates and what you're trying to achieve, and they're looking at what you've done, I do feel like effort comes into it. You know, that I do feel like there's a grey area that they play in, that they're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt somewhere along the line if you're not majorly deficient. You know.
So Steve and Sean have actually given you, I think, the key documentation. You want to document what your risks are. You want to document why you're not doing certain things, and if you think it's not applicable, and that will go a long way.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. So we've got a few questions, and I think we should try and run through these. So I'll open it up to any of you. Feel free to answer. Under the SEC's proposed ruling regarding outsourcing, so we just discussed this one, do you believe that cybersecurity and IT will be considered a core function under that proposed rule?
I do. I mean, I agree with Steve when he referenced that. I think that from my perspective, there are a lot of areas that are going to be potentially covered by that, but I definitely would think that cybersecurity and outsourcing of information technology would be, you know, front and center.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, you know, with a lot of these new rules and rule proposals, it's a great idea to look at the SEC's adopting release. It's a terrific source of insight as to exactly how the commission is thinking about particular aspects of a rule. And in this case, they actually list about 7 or 8 different categories that they believe would be included as one of these core functions. Cybersecurity is listed amongst that group. So I think the strong inference is this should be considered a core function. And if any significant part of your IT or cyber program is being outsourced, then this will probably be in scope.
Okay, great. So next question, what do panelists think about partial outsourcing of specific functions like SOC and SIEM services, vulnerability scanning or pen testing, as opposed to outsourcing the full spectrum? So anyone on the call who doesn't understand that technical language, SOC and SIEM services is continuous monitoring of your environment and logging and potential alerting of things that are happening in real time. Vulnerability scanning is the internal scanning of your devices, and pen testing is penetration testing from outside the network.
So full disclosure, Linedata offers these services, but I do think they can be incredibly valuable for the customers that take them up, because that allows them to focus on their core function.
And Don, you've bought these services and you've provided them through Linedata.
That's correct.
With my view is that outsourcing is actually, it's easier to buy these services through outsourcing. And I think what this question is alluding to is, do you take your service-based functions that can be carried out by an outsourced provider and just give them to an outsourced provider? And do you take your more policy-driven type activity and keep it in-house? That's kind of, I think, what they're gearing towards.
And that does seem to be what's going on right now in the industry.
And I would just, you know, add that I agree. I think in some ways, outsourcing, you know, or utilizing experts in the industry to assist with some of these functions, in particular around like vulnerability scans, when there are really effective tools out there, as opposed to trying to build something internally, is really useful. And also, from my perspective, if you're in an audit, whether or not it's the SEC or like an audit by a cybersecurity provider or a client, and you have a very effective third-party tool in place, it's most likely going to be more of a check-the-box type exercise as part of that assessment, as opposed to if you built something internally, they're likely going to want to really dig into the details to make sure it's an effective tool. It's the same thing if you're a firm that uses models in your investment advisory business, they're going to want to dig in to make sure those models are actually effective and working. If you're using a third-party software that is well regarded in the industry, I think you're going to reduce the amount of time you have to spend explaining the effectiveness of that tool.
Absolutely.
I would
Absolutely.
just add that many third parties are also going to provide you with some level of assurance through a SOC report or an ISO certification or something similar that will also help with your audits.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. In terms of cybersecurity, cyber insurance, do you think organizations tend to sufficiently track and maintain compliance with controls they claim or commit to operating? Is there too much variance in what companies are considering good enough? That's a very good question. Who wants to take that one?
Well, this is a great question. And I think what it really reveals is the importance of understanding what are the requirements under an insurance policy. So firms will sign up for cyber insurance and take some comfort in the fact that there is something in place. However, many of these policies require certain very specific steps, controls to be adopted in order to qualify for coverage. So you may experience a cyber incident, and if you have not adopted the required controls, you may not, the policy may not be applicable, or you may not be eligible to collect under the coverage. So for example, controls may include things like a separate verification, like speaking with a live person when a transfer request is being made. It could be certain monitoring controls. There could be certain requirements that apply to requests over a certain dollar threshold, and there may be others. So while there are a number of controls that you'll see consistently required amongst providers, there are some nuances depending upon who's providing the insurance. And the most important thing is if you do have cyber insurance in place, it's a good idea to just take a look at what are the requirements and make sure that you've implemented steps to abide by those provisions.
I would just like to ask Steve, what are your thoughts on if you comply with the SEC's new regulations, do you think you will be in good shape for your cybersecurity insurance provider?
I think, in terms of some of the rule proposals that are pending that we've discussed from February, it's a good idea to take a look at some of those things. Many of them, I think most advisors already have in place, as we've talked about. Most advisors have policies and procedures specific to cyber. Those will be very helpful in terms of meeting an insurance carrier's requirements. But even the SEC proposals don't get into some of the specifics that some of these insurance carriers are requiring, such as like a verification or certain specific controls, whereas the SEC has left it up more to the industry to determine what specific provisions may be appropriate. So there isn't always an overlap between the two, and I don't think you can rely solely on following SEC guidance, whether it's something from the Division of Examinations or looking at this proposed rule. You still have to look at the policy and its requirements.
Thank you. I appreciate your insight.
I would add, just based on what Stephen mentioned earlier on the rule proposal by the SEC around cybersecurity, the notification requirement of a breach, you also have to really look at what your policy requires. We had an incident a couple of years ago where we were assessing whether it was a cyber breach. It ended up not being, but one of the first things I did was go to our insurance carrier or our broker, and we started reviewing the policy to see when we had to make notification to the carrier to make sure that we didn't inadvertently breach the policy and give them an out from having to provide coverage. And so, as part of your incident response planning, I would have front and center, looking at your cyber insurance program to make sure that you address that and talk to the carrier as soon as possible, or within the time frame, so you don't end up being in a position of not having coverage.
Okay, great. So probably the last question: does the Cyber Incident Reporting Act of 2021 mandate continuous monitoring, as you cannot report what you are not monitoring?
Well, I don't think it per se requires continuous monitoring, or explicitly says that. But what it does require is an effective program. And so if industry standards would dictate that there is a way to continuously monitor something, and that's what most in the industry are doing, and you're not doing it, you can't bury your head in the sand and just say, well, if we can't detect it, then we're in the clear. So I would say that then you have a whole issue that your program is going to be deemed ineffective, and you're going to end up in a circumstance where you're not only in a pickle because you weren't able to detect something and report it, but you also didn't have adequate tools in place to detect it, which you should have. So it's a double whammy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank the panelists for coming and giving us some great insights into the way the cybersecurity regulatory side works. And as I said, there'll be a recording of this, so if you want to rewatch it, if you want to share it to anyone, then make sure that you share it. Yeah, thank you very much.